Hi everybody. This video is about an introduction into watercolor. So let's get started. To set up, you want a board with a watercolor sheet taped down. We want to have a cup of water, watercolor set, some brushes, and a paper towel. Secondly, what we want to do to practice today is we want to set up squares or rectangles, and we can use a masking tape to break up areas of your paper so we can have different areas to work in. Keeps it nice and clean. I'm going to have about 9 different areas on mine. You can have as many as you want on yours. And my squares are around 2 inches by 3 inches. I want a medium to small brush. When I get started today, I have a palette with dry watercolor cakes. So sometimes I need to wet these. And for our first one, we're going to do something called a flat wash. We want to have a good pool of a paint on our palette. So I'm using green, and I want to have a good ratio of water to pigment. In this one, we're going to be using some gravity to pull color down to create a nice, clean, flat color. So I'm going to drag a line. If it's not wet enough, make sure you get it wet like I do right here. So it's kind of hanging down with the pigment. And every line I bring, I grab the pigment above it and drag the next line. So I'm using gravity to help pull the watercolor down slowly. And when I get to the edge of my square, I actually just use what's remaining on my brush so I don't have a big wet edge at the bottom. And if I do, I can always use paper towel to dry it up. Most of the techniques we're going to use involve gravity, so you'll see me tilting the board a lot today. So a flat wash is good when you want to have a nice, clean, flat backdrop. The graded washes, which is one of the most popular washes that we use, involves going from one intensity of a color to another. So I'm going to use an intense purple by dragging a line across with it to get an intense purple line. Once that's done, I'm going to keep it nice and wet. I'm going to clean my brush completely just by dabbing it in the water. And then I'm going to work from the other edge of this rectangle with clean water, and I grab that purple and let it rain down. Again, clean water, I'm just going to grab that, and it's going to dilute it as it goes across the paper. I can now push the purple back towards the deeper purple side, or I can tilt the board and let gravity do the job too. Sometimes if I have too much watercolor on one side, I push it across to the other while it's still actively wet, and I can also, like a vacuum cleaner, absorb some extra with my paper towel. Again, I'm just going to lightly grab it with lines of the brush, and that will help create smoother results and create a transition called a fade. Some people call it an ombre, but it's called a graded wash. Now make sure to clean your palette every once in a while. All you got to do is dab a wet paper towel, and you can clean your tray very easily and lift out colors that might contaminate other colors you use. Now for the next one, it's called a variegated wash. This means a variety wash. This is when you want to transition from one color into another, such as like when you see a sunset. So I'm going to use a little pool of like an orangey red, and I'm going to pick yellow. I'm going to let them fade together. So you want to have kind of a really wet pigment mix there. Watery, but still strong with pigment. So it's a good ratio of color to water. So I'm going to start by just bringing in yellow for most of my square, and then on one edge I'm going to bring in the orange and just going to work it into it back and forth with my soft brush strokes. We already have a fade. To improve it, I can now drag more orange in there and let gravity help feed the two colors together. What we're trying to do here is not see where one color ends and the other begins. We want to have a fade. You can always wipe up excess watery areas with paper towel. The wet on wet method, some people it reminds them of the tie-dye method. We're going to wet the surface of the watercolor paper first with the brush with clean water. And then I'm going to pick one color, like this little turquoise blue, and I'm going to put a few drops, and you can see it blooms out onto the wet surface, hence the wet on wet technique. So you get very soft effects. This could be really nice for doing some clouds in the sky. Now I'm going to take a purple, I'm going to dab it the same way, and we're going to start having the purple and the blue interact just by shifting the board and letting gravity feed color into each other. They're going to start to react and create some effects that will happen spontaneously. And when you really like how something's looking, you can just let it lay flat and let it dry like that. Or you can push more color in, like I am, and let it work again into itself, and you'll create even more variations. This is very good for like underwater scenes, space scenes, so you can get some really great effects or backgrounds in your works this way too. Have fun with like the two colors you pick, because when they interact, they're going to create new colors. Okay, paths. What does that mean? Well, just to show some control in what watercolor does, I'm going to, before I pick color, I'm just going to wet my brush and I'm going to draw some clean water lines, these little kind of noodle lines. You might not see them, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pigment and I'm going to drop it into those lines. And if I tilt the paper, you're going to see gravity just feeds it into that line, and it doesn't want to actually go anywhere else. So I'm creating new lines, and you're going to see how I just create a path, and then the color will feed into it like a road. Now, say you made a mistake or you wanted to take out some color. In this case, I want to get rid of everything. I can scrub it with some clean water, and while it's still wet, I can just lift out with my paper towel. You actually see this done a lot to create cloud effects in the sky. So if I have to heal an area, I have to react quickly, but I can clean up a really bad accident. I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush now. And we're going to do some mark making. Mark making is doing line art or line work. So I'm going to use more pigment and less paint so it's not a drippy brush. And I'm going to do kind of grass-like strokes. Try to flick and create a variety of line thicknesses. You can also see how long your watercolor stays on your brush before you have to get more. Helps you learn how much you can carry and for how long. So be playful, but just try to get some control like you're using a pen or marker. Here I'll do something like a palm leaf. Just by flicking lines, you can get like a palm tree look. It's really good to practice that to gain control with the watercolor brush. We're now going to go back to the first flat wash we did, and I'm going to do some transparent layering. So the colors can actually mix just by layering them over each other. So just by layering this yellow over that green, I create more of a lime green color just by that old darker green interacting with the yellow. Same thing will happen if I put this reddish orange over that. You get a new color that's transparently made by the two colors layered over each other. Now we're going to take the purple, we're going to layer it over that green. And you're going to get this kind of like steely, kind of cool gray. Don't overmix, just layer one color over another. That's pretty transparent. You're going to see some nice color interactions. Let's do some effects here. So I'm going to do one, it's called, you actually like blow with your mouth out like that, and you can actually push the wet paint around. You can actually use a straw to do this too. So you might hear me kind of blowing with my mouth that air, and that just creates those abstract effects. Could be really good for a drip effect, branches. So let's try that again. I'm going to do a little bit of red. Almost looks like blood spatter. I'm going to take a little bit of blue, and while that's still wet, I'm going to feed the blue into that path And you create some like pretty fun color interactions where you see like red, but you see like the blue working through there too. It's really nice for like abstract effects or for certain textures on objects or subject matter. Just be careful if you're painting when an area is still wet, you will pull the color from that. So that's what I just did right there. It's totally a great thing to do, but if you didn't like it, you want to lift out. So always be patient when you're watercoloring. Let an area dry if you don't want it to be affected by what you're painting around it. Watercolor is always active. So base coloring, what does that mean? Well, when I start a painting, I'm not going to put all my details down at once. So I'm going to paint some trees here, and I'm going to kind of draw them in. But this would be like the base layer of a row of trees. I can come back later and add more textures and shadows and highlights to it. But for right now, if I was going to start a little landscape, I would paint my trees pretty simplistically, let the colors interact, and then let it dry and come back and do more layering with more details after the fact. So again, a base coloring is just getting your base tones down and then coming back later. And I'm just going to do a soft edge on the bottom with a clean brush to create a soft edge at the bottom of those trees. So don't overthink your first layer of watercolor. You just want to get the basic colors down. It doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be going in the right direction. Now I'm going to hand draw a little horizon with like a little like tree line, and I'm going to do a little sunset. But again, this is more base coloring I'm going to show. So I'm going to wet the surface. And I'll show you a little example of like a sample sky. I'll do something similar to that. So if I were to paint this, I'm going to add yellow down first for my sunset. And then I'll interact where I believe it should be a little redder and warmer. So I'm using a little bit of red there in certain areas. And then like the variegated wash, I'm just going to let colors bleed together and just soften them till I get the blend I want. Now if I want to get a darker tone, I can add like a little purple into my red, create more of like a burgundy-ish warm violet color. I'm going to put it in that darker part of the atmosphere and just soften that in. Now, this can be a quick little watercolor landscape I'm doing right here, but it's just the base color effects. I can come back later and add all my other details and all my other layers that I really want to bring in there. But for right now, this is a good place to start for my painting if I'm doing a landscape, and then let it dry and come back with more layers on top. It's very important to let areas dry so you don't overwhelm an area and basically make it all muddied up with color. So that's a good start for me. I'm only going to do that tree line at the very end of the painting once I get my water and sky done. So we'll just leave that alone for another point when I want to go back into that. Now let's talk about brush pressure. This is very important. If I press lightly with a brush, I'm going to get thinner lines. Practice that. If I press a little heavier, a little heavier, a little heavier, I get thicker lines. So just practice knowing your brush pressure. And lastly, we'll talk about soft versus hard edges. So here's like a line. We'll say I want to keep one side soft and the other line hard. I can get clean water and just soften out that black, keep cleaning the water, and drag it out to get softer and softer grays. So you're going to find that you're going to want to paint something, but it has to have maybe a hard edge on one side and a soft edge on the other. What I'm doing is I'm just pulling away the color from that original line I brought to create a soft gradient edge, while the other side stays nice and sharp. kind of like a hill against the sky. So we covered a bunch of things. Practice is the most important thing. Get used to these techniques. Take a look at them. Pause this video and train yourself to practice these techniques and get really comfortable with them. There's more to follow. Good luck.